evening, everyone, and welcome to another Indiana University South Bend pop-up university with our partners at Lang Lab. It's great to see you all virtually tonight. We're, of course, always watching for the future when we can start having these hybrid and in person again, hopefully within a couple of months. And until then, we always love seeing you here. So hey, on with the show. We are pleased to welcome tonight Professor of History, Dr. Monica Maria Tetzlaff, who's going to talk to us tonight about the role of history in reparations from the global to the local. It's going to be a terrific evening. She is a thoughtful and wonderful speaker and has some terrific guests with us here tonight to talk about things. Before we get started, I'd just like to point out that that Pop-Up University is a production of both the Community Engagement Office and the Center for Excellence in Research and Scholarship at IU South Bend. If you're interested in hearing more about Professor Tetzlaff's research or learning more about other research going on at IU South Bend, please contact folks at Ceres, me or any of my board. And if you're interested in how Indiana University South Bend could be of help to you in the community and ways in which your group organization could intersect with IU South Bend, please feel free to contact my colleague, Dr. Gail McGuire, Director of Community Engagement. Both sites available through academics.iusb.edu. And of course, Pop-Up University wouldn't be possible without all of our friends who support us. We especially thank Indiana Humanities, as well as the following IUSB departments and offices, so many to mention, but especially Academic Affairs, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and a great many individual departments. Thank you all very much. But enough about all of this. You've come here to listen to Professor Tetzlaff. Dr. Monica Maria Tetzlaff has been a professor at IU South Bend since 1994. She's a former director of the IU Civil Rights Heritage Center, and she leads Freedom Summer Civil Rights Tours with Dr. Daryl Heller. Her areas of teaching and research interest include African American history, U.S. women's history, the history of the environmental movement, and African history and gender. She's a wonderful speaker, and I'm going to turn it over to her. Monica, if I turn off my screen sharing.
Okay, thanks, Josh. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for attending this lecture. I'm going to start with some slides, then go back to just talking to you, and then go into the bulk of my slideshow. So let's try sharing the screen here. And going to my PowerPoint. Okay, good. So I want to start with thanks to the musician you heard at the beginning. John Baptiste has a lovely album with some terrific, what we used to call liner notes, but you can read them on Apple Music or however you listen to your albums. And even though our topic is very serious tonight and you might feel emotions of sadness and anger, it's always important to remember that we need to take care of ourselves and also feel joy. And that's especially true for those people who have been victims of oppression and who have resisted oppression and continue to resist oppression, like African Americans. But I think it's true for all of us. I want to also thank those people that I know. I don't know John Baptiste personally. I just like to listen to him. But my spouse, Brad, my daughter, Hannah, and all of the friends at IUSB who helped to put this talk together, as well as my sister Jenny and others who hold me up as I do this work. So let me move along here, and in the spirit of John Baptiste, who says, "Tell the truth," I want to begin here with a land acknowledgement. For Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the United States, there has been theft of land. And so we acknowledge and honor the Indigenous communities native to this region and recognize that IU South Bend was built on Indigenous land. Indigenous homelands and resources. Indiana University South Bend recognizes the Potawatomi, Peoria, Miami, Kickapoo, Kaskaskia, Mascoutin, and Meskwaki people as past, present, and future caretakers of this land. When I asked for help with this presentation, I want to acknowledge that there were some people in the South Bend Reparations Working Group who were especially important to me, and one of those is Deb Stanley, founder and director of Imani Unidad. And it's she who said that there has been theft of land, human dignity, and human culture, and it continues to this day. Her question that I'd like you to keep in mind as we go through the various kinds of reparations in history and the role of the historian. Her question is, are reparations to repair harm or merely compensation for harm? I'm going to turn off this screen sharing for a moment and tell you a little bit about why I do this. And it's not always easy to talk about these things, but I am the beneficiary of a kind of reparations that were paid to my mother's family because Germany started World War II, which resulted in my mother's family of ethnic Germans losing their farm in Hungary because they fled when the Soviet Union invaded Hungary, which was an ally of Germany. My family used this one-time payment of several $1,000s in the early 1950s to buy a 3-flat in Chicago. And I think you're going to see in this talk that buildings in Chicago have come up quite often in the case for reparations. My grandparents lived in one of the flats and rented the others, generating income beyond what they could make in their low-income jobs. They eventually sold this building and bought a house in Vero Beach, Florida, a sundown town in an area where African Americans were excluded as homeowners or renters. This home appreciated in value and continues to provide me with a cushion of savings since I inherited it. As a beneficiary of a kind of reparations, I wish to extend that benefit to others. I am also a Quaker, a faith in which I try to follow the divine parent's call to peace, equality, integrity, and community. For all these reasons, I am part of the South Bend Reparations Working Group, about which I'll give more details later. Finally, as you know, I'm a history professor, and that is the main focus of our talk today. How can historians serve community discussion on reparations? And I want to say right away that if you're for reparations, if you're against reparations, or if you're not sure, I'm glad you're here. We need all of us to be part of this dialogue, and I'm so glad that you've come to be further educated, and I'm ready to listen to you. So let's have some slides. And we shall begin with, of course, a definition. What are reparations? Reparations according to Webster's dictionary, are the making of amends for wrong or injury done. And when I heard that word amends, I immediately thought of the 12-step program and the 12 steps of recovery from addiction. Step 8 is we made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. And step 9 is made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. I'm going to move now to something that's a little bit more along the lines of global peacemaking, but I'd like you to keep that notion, that personal notion of making amends in mind. Lori Nathan, I had the privilege of speaking with him in preparation for this talk and hearing him. He is Director of Mediation at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. And he gives us a conceptual framework for thinking about reparations and reconciliation. Because you can't just jump to the reconciliation. It's a journey of 4 parts. The first part is truth-telling, historical research, including oral history with those who have been harmed. We need to ask, what harm was done? To whom? By whom? With whose support? And who has benefited from the harm? Number 2 is acknowledgement and apology. And here historians can help with museums and memorials, historic park markers, national park sites, and other remembrances. The next steps on the journey are reparations. What kind of reparations needs to be addressed by those who are harmed or their descendants? If the wrongdoing is embedded in contemporary social and political systems, rectification requires systemic and institutional reform. Then, in the 4th step, we might have reconciliation, the healing and building of relationships, but this necessarily depends on structural transformation. Indeed, the whole process is one of transformation. The process is important. No step can be skipped. And it's also important to remember that every step involves dialogue and conflict. That's a good thing and not a bad thing. So let's look at one of the most famous cases of reparations and also of evil, the Holocaust. And I wish to acknowledge that today is Yom Kippur, the Jewish Day of Atonement. But I feel that atonement is really something that I'm working on here in this story. Susan Nyman is a Jewish American from Atlanta. She grew up as a white person in the South, and then when she went to Germany, she was a Jewish person. Of course, she was always Jewish. Her mother was part of the civil rights movement, and she feels that there are lessons for us in how to remember and teach about the history of the Confederacy, slavery, and racism, lessons from the Germans. So let's look at German reparations, or Wiedergutmachung. And I'm going to show off my ability to say long German words here. Okay, the next one is Lastenausgleich, which means burden sharing. It's not exactly reparations. That's what my parents, grandparents received for financial losses they suffered during World War II. At the same time, Germany offered compensation to the state of Israel and also compensation to individual German Jews. Through 1999, West Germany passed many other laws, and then United Germany passed many other laws for compensation of groups, including the Roma and communists. In 2000, the Foundation for Remembrance, Responsibility, and the Future was established by the government and 6,500 corporations to compensate for slave labor. Now, Nyman says that German reparations were miserly, and no matter what the amount, they were not enough. What was really important, she said, was Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung. Working through the past was needed. The generation with the memory of war couldn't face working through the past. When I read those lines, I felt that deeply. I knew this was my family. But then, inspired by the African-American freedom struggle, the 1960s generation of Germans went into the streets and demanded the truth be taught. I could see the way that those younger Germans, including some, actually my father's younger sibling, was so much more free to really be anti-racist and to embrace that as a mission of being a German. In 2000 and beyond, public acknowledgement and remembrance took off in Germany. Studying Auschwitz is required in the national school curriculum, and a memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe was located in the capital, Berlin. You're going to see an echo of this memorial in the memorial to the victims of lynching in Montgomery, Alabama, that we'll look at later in the slideshow. Okay. Another element of remembrance is smaller scale, and I think even more powerful. These little designations, indentations in the paving stones in Berlin have the names of people who lived in the buildings that were there, who were murdered at Auschwitz. That's what it says on the bottom line of their stones. They're called stumbling stones, but you don't actually trip on them. They're meant to disturb the mind, to cause a stumbling in your everyday existence, noticing that this happened here. Let's turn now to the United States. During World War II, the United States interned over 120,000 Japanese, including American citizens. In fact, a large number were American citizens. You can get a little bit of the sense of being sent away from their homes with very little notice and then put into camps where they lived in barracks in the desert from this artwork. I want to mention that I became sensitive to this issue when I was in 5th grade because my teacher read us this book in 1974, Journey to Topaz by Yoshiko Uchida. And the author was indeed a child who had experienced the journey to Topaz, the relocation camp, as it was called, in the desert. And you can see the barbed wire here. Excuse me. And I don't remember any other books that she read us. Thinking back on it now, I wish that she had also read us a book about an African-American child's experience, maybe in Tulsa, Oklahoma, being driven away in 1921 during the Tulsa race riot. Or I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. But we weren't getting any of that in Vero Beach, Florida, because I was in an all-white school located around here on the Barrier Island, and a mile away, they had just integrated the public school with children from Gifford, which was the only area where African Americans could live. There are so many stories here in my hometown that I never learned until very recently, even some as late as researching this talk about how land at the Vero Beach Municipal Airport was taken from Black families who lived nearby. Let me go back though to the journey to Topaz and the path to reparations for Japanese Americans. They were inspired by the civil rights movement, much as young Germans were. And in my hometown, there were things going on. There was a huge effort by the NAACP to integrate those schools. And I eventually joined the integrated public school. But for Japanese Americans, they felt their leaders had let them down. They wanted to remember what had happened in internment, and they wanted some answers and some compensation from the US government. So they organized a pilgrimage to Manzanar. That's one of the camps. And you can see later on a farewell to Manzanar. Another memoir was written that moved many people. This pilgrimage wording comes up also with Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. There was a youth pilgrimage to Washington, D.C. in the 50s when schools were being integrated by Black students, calling on the power of prayer behind these brave acts by young people. And then in 1965-66, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta and the United Farm Workers had a pilgrimage from Delano to Sacramento to support the striking farm workers. So all of these calls for justice inspired young Japanese Americans. And then in '78, the Japanese American Citizens League, which had been around the whole time, formed a redress committee. Some other books also contributed to, other history books also contributed to the Civil Liberties Act being passed in 1988 and reparations of $20,000 for Japanese Americans being passed. I'm going to come back to the last line on Native Aleuts in a moment. Here's a photograph of the president at the time signing the Civil Liberties Act. And here's the Japanese American Memorial in Washington, D.C. I just learned while researching this talk that reparations of $12,000 were given to each Native Aleut. And I set out to find out why. Well, it turns out that after Japanese attacks on Aleutian Islands, these are part of Alaska, Aleuts were relocated to internment camps for their safety. The barracks they were sent to were crowded and unheated. And even though they show smiling children here, the conditions were pretty dire. Medical care was lacking and 10% of them died, a higher percentage than Japanese Americans. In 1945, World War II was over, and the government slowly and haphazardly allowed the Aleuts to return. They found that their homes had been looted by Americans, that their sacred objects had been desecrated and stolen. So why did they receive only $12,000? Well, there is a historian who is Native Hawaiian who argues that the Aleuts had less political clout than the middle-class Japanese Americans, and also were still living in poverty, which didn't look so good. She also thinks that charges of genocide that Native Americans have made towards the European invaders of Turtle Island could be brought up again. And so this was a very quiet payment. We can think about Deb Stanley's question here. Was there compensation or repair of harm? There's so much more that could be said about reparations for Native Americans, and I urge you to educate yourself. And I have some sources in the list of sources that I'm going to provide to anyone interested. But in order to do it justice, I'm going to have to leave it there and go on to my topic of expertise, which is African American studies. I want to start here with a great deal of gratitude to Robert Francis Engs, PhD, professor at the College of William and Mary, and also at the University of Pennsylvania, where I did my graduate work with him. He returned to the College of William and Mary in his retirement and worked on the Lemon Project. Lemon was enslaved by the College of William and Mary. And this project involved him finding out Lemon's name. And of course, the university thought this was a terrible name for the project because, you know, lemons have a negative connotation in our culture. And he said, no, this is the man's name, and it's going to be the Lemon Project. And it is. This has resulted in a memorial to the enslaved and a great deal of research. But even though they call it a journey of reconciliation, there is no mention of the step of reparations. So there is no compensation in this case. We may ask, where is the repair of harm? I think I need to get involved with the Lemon Project at William and Mary before I become critical of it, because I think that folks are doing the best they can to make this meaningful. But it's hard. It's a hard thing to do. I also want to draw your attention to IU is having a presentation on universities and slavery on the 28th. And you can find that on the IU website. I'd like to turn now away from universities to our national context. The US government actually made an official apology to African Americans in 2008. And it reads that the House of Representatives acknowledges that slavery is incompatible with the basic founding principles recognized in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. The US government recognizes the fundamental injustice, cruelty, brutality, and inhumanity of slavery and Jim Crow. The House of Representatives apologizes to African Americans on behalf of the people of the United States for the wrongs committed against them and their ancestors who suffered under slavery and Jim Crow. And the House of Representatives expresses its commitment to rectify the lingering consequences of the misdeeds committed against African Americans under slavery and Jim Crow. And Jim Crow is segregation and disfranchisement, and to stop the occurrence of human rights violations in the future. Now, this one hasn't passed. This is House of Representatives Bill number 40, introduced for I don't know how many, this is certainly not the first time, but it was introduced in 2019 most recently. A commission to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. This bill establishes the commission to study and develop reparation proposals. The commission shall examine slavery and discrimination in the colonies and the US from 1619 to the present and recommend appropriate remedies. Identifying the role of the federal government and state governments in supporting slavery and forms of discrimination in the public and private sector against freed slaves and their descendants, as well as the lingering negative effects of slavery on living African Americans and society. Interest in HR 40 and the case for reparations was accelerated in 2015 when Ta-Nehisi Coates published his article, The Case for Reparations. He included an interview with a gentleman named Clyde Ross, who had suffered many losses from his time in Mississippi through moving to Chicago and trying to buy real estate the same way that he saw white veterans of World War II buying real estate. But that was not to be. And this book draws heavily on not this book, but the article draws heavily on the book by historian Beryl Satter, Family Properties, which shows in the struggle over race and real estate in Chicago, how land contracts were a form of theft that African Americans suffered. And they resisted, as you can see in the photo here too, of the Contract Buyers League. I urge you to look at both of these works if you haven't had a chance to already. More recently, William Darity and Kirsten Mullen have published From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. Their argument draws heavily on history as well, but Darity is an economist, so he's got a lot of the wealth gap figures that you might be looking for, and also a very cogent plan for how to provide reparations for African Americans who are descendants of slaves in the last chapter. Kirsten Mullen is a great storyteller, writer, and folklorist, and she brings in some of the personal angle here. I want to draw attention to the cover of their book, which has steel columns at the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. This was created by the Equal Justice Initiative. You may be familiar with the movie Just Mercy, or the book by Brian Stevenson. And that's an important piece of remembrance. I don't have a photo of it, but there's also an area where these columns lie like coffins, and they are meant to be taken home by counties where lynchings occurred in order to serve as markers in those counties and to create dialogue in those counties. I want to also mention, because it's important for us now moving closer and closer to our local context, that a 2017 book by Richard Rothstein looks at how our government segregated America. And you can see redlining on the cover there. I believe this is a Philadelphia neighborhood. And the Federal Housing Authority and private banks would not lend in those areas where African Americans were. So there are many details to this. I was completely shocked when I first learned of this in historian Thomas Segru's first book, The Origins of the Urban Crisis, a book about Detroit, another city that I love. And I had no idea that in that New Deal time period, there were so many ways that African Americans were treated differently, and lack of ability to build housing wealth was a major one. Okay, and now I hope I haven't taken too long with the global, because the local is so important to us here. I'd like to honor and acknowledge Dr. Les Lehman, historian and director of the Civil Rights Heritage Center, who first got me into all of this. I was already an African-American historian, a historian of African-American studies, but he took some students on the first Freedom Summer Tour, and they came back asking, what was the civil rights movement here in South Bend? And in order to provide some context and dialogue in our community, Dr. Lehman invited Randall Robinson of the Trans Africa Forum to speak at IU South Bend about the debt, reparations. One of the high points of local truth-telling for me was Professor Lehman's Lundquist lecture, Dealing with the Fox, Race Relations and Civil Rights in South Bend in 2004. In an IUSB lecture hall packed with community members, including elderly African Americans, Les presented the results of archival and oral history research by himself and students, revealing systemic racism and discrimination in South Bend and Mishawaka, in everything from employment, policing, and churches to theaters, clothing stores, and restaurants, as well as the infamous natatorium, an indoor swimming pool, which was a focal point of South Bend's civil rights movement. Like to also hold up the beautiful artistry of Paul Jude Guillaume, also a graduate of IUSB and a student who contributed his talents, photographing David Healy, the first student who led the oral history project that went on that first Freedom Summer tour. He wasn't much younger than he is in this photo here on the left when he started his work. He was a non-traditional student and he has since passed away. But also very important in this work was a friendship he developed with John Charles Bryant. John Charles Bryant is a member of one of the oldest African-American families in South Bend and a living repository of memory. With John Charles Bryant's help, David Healy was able to begin an interview process, which included many IUSB students of all races talking with elders in the community. Les and David also uncovered a book, the one and with the red cover here in the slide, The Negro in South Bend, a social study written in 1925 by sociologist and minister Reverend Buford F. Gordon. And that book showed Black exclusion from cultural, recreational, employment, and housing opportunities in South Bend in the 20s, as well as the accomplishments and institution building of African Americans despite those obstacles. David Healy wrote an introduction. And the research continued. The next book, Our Day, told the story of the natatorium. And the third book by Lisa Twardarski told of an African-American community and cultural center where, among many other wonderful things, an opera on the liberation of Haiti was debuted. And these were all Masters of Liberal Studies students. Their research led to the transformation, and I know we're talking about transformation today, of the natatorium, which had been abandoned by 1978 and then in 2000 was standing empty. Transformation from a segregated swimming pool to the IU South Bend Civil Rights Heritage Center, where so much dialogue happens and where history is told again and again to those who visit. Continuing on with our local knowledge, Gabrielle Robinson, a retired IUSB professor, has written Better Homes of South Bend about the folks that you see at the bottom of the bottom photo there in the slide, who fought to have homes of their own built. African Americans who were in the working and middle class and could not buy in other ways, banded together, worked together. They show that it shows the power of folks working through obstacles together, and the importance of lawyers. The lawyers Jay Chester and Elizabeth Fletcher Allen are here in the photo. There's Elizabeth and Jay Chester is in the back wearing glasses. A marker for them has also been part of Gabrielle Robinson's efforts at memorializing, and you can go see its unveiling this coming Saturday, September 18th. I want to tell a couple stories here and then turn it over to students because I know that they have some words to tell you. Mrs. Willie Bay Butts, whom you can listen to on the South Bend's Own Words podcast, tried to buy a home, but was told when she showed up that it was up to the neighbors whether she could move in. That's what her white real estate agent said. Roland Chambly, a physician and World War II veteran, had to resort to a white friend buying the home for him with Dr. Chambly's own money. And let me just pull together here what happened next. Then he sold the home back to Dr. Chambly, and when his family moved there, they began receiving death threats. Dr. Chambly set up booby traps and adopted large dogs to protect the house from violence. He was a veteran of World War II, as you can see as the photograph indicates through his salute, with a medal for injuries sustained dismantling bombs. He had the knowledge to set traps, not to kill, but to warn him of intruders. He succeeded. But if that is what it took, few could go to these lengths to accumulate real estate and generational wealth in the 1950s. I'd like to feature now two students, Mohammed Shabazz and Derek Webb, who will speak to what they found out through the Oral History Project. Mohammed Shabazz, who's part of the County Voter Registration Office, will speak to Acknowledgement, and Derek Webb, who has written a book on open housing, will speak to housing discrimination. Josh, can you empower them to start, please?
Did you want Derek or Mohammed to start?
Mohammed, please.
Mohammed, you should have the ability to turn your camera and the microphone on.
Okay.
Oh, there you are. Lovely.
Okay, so I am going to speak to the acknowledgement and apology part of this. I once thought that acknowledgement, well, first, let me acknowledge all of you who are here. We appreciate that. My name is Mohammed Shabazz. I'm a history graduate from IUSB. I was lucky.
I think you might be frozen, Mohammed.
You know, all the harms that happen, and it would go from there, and then the apology would be next. But apologies can be important. Today, we have people who won't acknowledge, who will not acknowledge this. We just saw around the country, politicians running around talking about they don't want people to learn critical race theory as if we were teaching that in schools in the first place. So they don't want to even acknowledge that there was a harm done. But that is the first step. The first step is that we have to acknowledge that it happened. And that's where, and then apologies are strong. Once you have acknowledgments and apologies, then you can go from there to the discussion of how to repair the damage. So when we think about this, there were acknowledgments in the past that were just wiped over. So if you think about General Sherman's Field Order 15, that was the basis of 40 acres and a mule, right? That was an acknowledgement that there was a harm. And so he was, I don't know if he was trying to repair it or if he was just trying to fix the situation at the time, but it was an acknowledgement. And so, but soon as short time later, that was wiped off. The 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments might have been acknowledgements that there was a harm committed, but those laws were not passed specific to Black people. So once you acknowledge and apologize, you have to have laws then to rectify the situation. And in order for these politicians to pass such laws, it takes historians to come up with the information for them to work on. They don't have it, right? So it's up to us to do it. So when we talk about South Africa, for example, acknowledged and apologized, but did the dialogue continued, but were there compensation? No. And is it about compensation, right? Or is it about just acknowledging that there was a harm caused to an entire race of people? So I think it is my personal opinion that the whole reparations talk has to start on a local level. And this is why the reparations working group is so important, because like if we look at Evanston, Illinois, that city has started to not only acknowledge and apologize, but start the entire conversation and come up with ideas on how to repair the harm. Just recently, I read an article about a family in California whose land was stolen 100 years ago, and that city, or the entire state, because it had to be a state law passed because they took the land because of eminent domain. So it takes a state law to give it back. But now they're talking about giving them this land back, right? So reparations could take many different forms, but first, an acknowledgement had to be given and an apology has to be given. Apologies can be very strong when it comes to situations of this magnitude, right? Because this is not a small issue, you know. So, and we're going to have the entire. We know right now that the first thing people say is you weren't a slave, and I didn't own slaves, right? So the conversation should not even start with slavery. It should start with the 100 years after. So you can talk about Rosewood, and you can talk about Tulsa, and you can talk about all of these places. And because those weren't one-off things. Those things happened all over. You know, people were run out of town, their land was taken, and all of these things. So you have to start at the local level, in my opinion, because the local level is the only level that can actually handle it. If you tried to get reparations from the federal government, you would probably break the government. And I will pass it to Derek. I'm keeping my eye on.
Thank you. Go ahead, Derek. We can't hear Derek.
Derek, I'm not seeing any activity on your microphone feed. Your microphone may be unhooked.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, wonderful.
Yes. All right. Hey, first try, not too bad for a Zoom call. It usually takes a couple. All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Tetzlaff, and thank you, Mohammed. Before I fully dive in, I just wanted to give a little background of how I came to know about race and housing in South Bend. And I was born and raised in the city. And as a young man, it became very clear to me that South Bend, like most cities in the North or throughout the United States, was a segregated city. And and a lot of my friends and people I knew, it occurred to me that African Americans tended to live in some of the more impoverished parts of the city. Now, this wasn't everyone, of course, but it was something that I certainly noticed. And this question weighed heavy on my mind and heart as I entered IU South Bend. And sort of my first salvo into trying to understand the nature of race relations in the United States and locally was to take the Freedom Summer trip down south. And the Freedom Summer trip was an academic tour. I took it in 2006 of civil rights sites in the Southern United States. And it taught me a lot about the nature of Jim Crow in the South. But like the students that came before me on the inaugural trip in 2000 that formed the Civil Rights Heritage Center, I had a lot of questions. What about locally here? What happened in South Bend? Did we have our own civil rights movement? To what level was there segregation and discrimination here at home? So when I returned to South Bend, along with a lot of the other students, I wanted to get involved. So I got involved at the Civil Rights Heritage Center. And the way that the Civil Rights Heritage Center documented local history was through the Oral History Project. And of course, people like David Healy that came before me that helped found that, and Dr. Les Lehman, who ultimately helped me edit the book that I'm working on. They were documenting South Bend's history through the Oral History Project. And of course, Monica was my mentor throughout college. I graduated as a history major, but she helped me dive into this research and asked me to look specifically at the issue of race and housing. So currently I'm working, or I have finished a manuscript that's in its final stages of editing, and a big thanks to Les Lehman and Ken Smith for working on that. It's part of the On Their Shoulders series. But in my research, I came to realize two things, and the book is essentially broken into two parts. The first part is the rise of residential segregation and the entrenchment of segregation in South Bend from roughly 1900 to World War II. And then in the post-World War II era and those 2 decades after, how did locals and African Americans respond to segregation, and how did they try to overturn it? So I want to start sort of from the beginning of the 20th century. And at that time, there was less than 500 African Americans living in South Bend, and they were actually well dispersed throughout the city. There wasn't clear Black neighborhoods, or the residential segregation hadn't fully developed yet. And it was because a lot of people lived in white neighborhoods and worked as domestics. But coming into World War I, this began to shift and change, and racial attitudes in the city really began to harden. And that's when things shifted and you had racial barriers created throughout the city. And Buford Gordon actually said in his empirical study in 1925 that it's not the character, and I'm quoting here, of the Negroes, but it's the coming of many. And really it's with the Great Migration from World War I to World War II, and the push from the Jim Crow South as African Americans came north to seek better opportunities in the so-called promised land in the north, to find better housing opportunities and better jobs for their families. That's when things began to shift here locally. And when I say attitudes, yes, local attitudes helped underpin residential segregation, but really it was government policy from the top down, all the way from the federal level with FHA policy, including redlining, all the way to the local level. And insurance agencies, mortgage banks refused to give insurance or grant loans to African Americans. You had restrictive covenants in our community. So you had all these tools that were used by segregationists. And many of these tools, because they were official government policy, were actually de jure in nature. And I think that's a very important part of the reparations question. And I'll talk a little bit about that as I sort of wrap up talking about local history. So during that period, you have some strict racial dividing lines established in the city. One was Lincoln Way Avenue. Few, if any, African Americans by World War II lived north of Lincoln Way. Few lived south of Western Avenue, and few lived to the east of Twickenham Drive on the east side of the city. There were 5 areas of African American settlement within the city, most were on the west side, and they tended to be concentrated because of segregation in the poorest and neighborhoods with the oldest housing stock. And because of the pressures of overcrowding, the housing stock quickly dilapidated. And these slum areas sort of became ghettos because of the nature of segregation in the city. But then moving into how people responded to locally to segregation in the post-World War II era, and I want to highlight one particular individual, and that's William Russell Morris. He's African American. He grew up on the east side, actually, from a relatively affluent family. He went to Pearly School and then ultimately graduated from Central High School. And he was kind of an all-American kid, was a Boy Scout. He joined the military. He actually was trained as a pilot at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. And after returning from the war, he came home to South Bend, and he wanted to do something about the segregation that he knew existed here at home. And one of the ways that he began to try to break down the barriers in South Bend was by becoming South Bend's first African-American real estate agent. And he created his own business as well. And he believed in open housing. If you could afford and wanted to live in any neighborhood in the city, he believed you should have the opportunity to do so. But he was up against some very tall barriers in trying to make that a reality. The local board of realtors denied him access 4 times over a 20-year period to the board. And in fact, the first African-American realtor wasn't accepted on the board of realtors until 1969. And that's honestly because of William Morris's work to try to have that done. In the meantime, the board had a policy that they would not introduce African Americans to white neighborhoods. So throughout this period, William Morris not only tried to open up neighborhoods through his business, but he also spearheaded the South Bend open housing movement, which began roughly in the mid-1950s. There was a lot of educational initiatives. But in 1961, he helped form what was called the Citizens Fair Housing Committee. And the goal of the Citizens Fair Housing Committee was ultimately to pass a local open housing ordinance that made discrimination in housing illegal. They made their first attempt in 1963. They organized a Citizens Fair Housing Committee hearing to document local cases of discrimination. And there were many, too many to document, but they had a lot of middle-class African Americans that tried to buy homes in white neighborhoods to give their testimonies of how they had bricks thrown through their windows or were denied access or realtors wouldn't show them homes. There are many, many examples. And then in 1964, they put the ordinance to the test in the South Bend Common Council, which at that point had no African American representatives on the council, and it was rejected. It took until 1968 for the housing ordinance to ultimately pass because of the work of the Citizens Fair Housing Committee, and honestly changing attitudes nationally because of the civil rights movement. Once the ordinance passed, it didn't do a lot to break down barriers to segregation. They were already entrenched. And the reason it didn't is because it was symbolic and a great victory that way, but it didn't have a lot of teeth. And then the civil rights movement locally and in other places began to fizzle out after that. And the patterns of residential segregation and poverty persist to this day in South Bend. But the main thing is that during that window from World War II to roughly 1970, that was the greatest period of generational wealth growth in the United States for white Americans. And that was underpinned by the FHA and VA loans and the access to mortgages and home ownership. And that generational wealth then grew and was carried forward for white families, where African Americans were systematically denied that opportunity. And because of that today, many African Americans still find themselves living in impoverished neighborhoods, not only in South Bend, but throughout this nation. And that's why that context of history is so important to understand, and why reparations are not only necessary, but long overdue.
Thank you, Derek. Appreciate it. I know we don't have a lot of time left, so I'm going to try to wrap it up here. I think it's powerful hearing from both of these alums who have a great knowledge of history. I'm going to share here a little bit about the South Bend Reparations Working Group. Actually, the slide I have here is my current work, and I should mention it before I do that. And that is on the Streets family. They also fought for human rights, both in movie theaters, the natatorium, and through support for Head Start and El Centro. And their son also experienced housing discrimination. Let me move on here to acknowledge Daryl Heller and get my slideshow mode going here again. He is the current director of the Civil Rights Heritage Center and an assistant professor of women's and gender studies. And his talk in 2019 started the South Bend Reparations Working Group, in which he plays a leading role. I want to also acknowledge Nimbalasha Kussing, who has written a beautiful memoir called Come This Way, There Is an Exit, about her life growing up in the South, picking cotton, and then moving to the big city. We're very lucky that she ended up here in South Bend, and she is an activist and facilitator of the South Bend Reparations Working Group, which has been meeting and educating and advocating since 2019. Here is our mission statement. The purpose of this program is to address a fractured society in South Bend. We will examine our past history influenced by national and local policies and practices that produced race discrimination, prejudice, and injustice. The effect today is a gap in wealth, income, education, and employment opportunity for our Black citizens. We hope to explore and understand why this happened and what we should do and can do to repair it. As we move into the next part, where I hope you will be able to stay and engage in some dialogue, let me also note from a former IUSB professor, Margaret Feinstein, some wisdom from a psychologist who worked in Rwanda. Healing is needed for the perpetrator and the victim. Reparations are restorative justice that allow the victim group to heal and gain a sense of stability. Rescuers, that is good people in the perpetrator group, are able to apologize for their group. And through active listening in small groups of perpetrators and victims with trained facilitators, a community can imagine a shared future together. As I look around here in IU South Bend's campus, I see across the way Playland Park used to be where the housing is, and the South Bend Blue Sox played there. That's a wonderful marker there that remembers them. But Black families, Black women could not play professional baseball during World War II. They had to have quite another league of their own with less pay and less recognition. And in the neighborhoods here around IU South Bend, there was violence when Blacks wanted to move into those neighborhoods. That's where Dr. Street's son, actually the white family who wanted to sell to them, experienced violence, and they decided not to move there. And that meant that generational wealth could not be passed down. How do we make these wrongs right? I will conclude with some slides for you to have some questions to consider. Okay. And these are, how does this topic, the role of history and reparations, illuminate the human experience for you? Could those of us with generational wealth give up a percentage of what we are passing on to our children and grandchildren and use that money for reparations for a more equitable world? And what actions might we take as individuals and as a community to transform our society to prevent harm based on race? Thank you, and let the dialogue begin.
Thank you so much, Monica and Shabazz and Mohammed and Derek. I think we have a couple of quick questions that should be, we can maybe work through pretty quickly, and then open it up for people to respond to your questions as well. So the first question was whether or not the lecture by Les Lehman is still available, if there's an audio version of that.
I don't know, but I'm writing down these good suggestions.
Or a transcript, perhaps, to be read.
Les Lehman is actually—
There is a transcript available. I believe there was one archived at the Schurz Library, and I have a copy as well. So if somebody wanted to leave their information in the chat, I could reach out to them with that.
And I think that Dr. Tetzlaff also mentioned that when we post the link to this recording, we'll also post a link to the references. So maybe we can add that perhaps to the references as well. Great question. The next question was, you mentioned sort of towards the end of your remarks there, a number of activities that have started in South Bend, looking at reparations. The question is whether those groups or that group is working with the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations and COBRA.
Not that I know of, but we're not opposed to it. If anyone else from the group wants to type into the chat or say anything, they're welcome to.
Okay, great. If you could maybe share your screen with that last set of questions, I think
Okay.
we can ask people to submit comments in the chat. There's certainly been a number of comments in the chat, just mentioning how the students and of course your work as well, Dr. Tetzlaff, is very inspiring. I wondered too, as we move into the conversation, if those of us who aren't students, I think I represent that contingent here, if there are ways in which you would like to see the community, like if there's one or two specific things that the community could do outside maybe the research or academic environment here locally in South Bend that you would suggest.
Shall I speak to that while the slide is up?
Yeah, I think so. And that will give people time to, continue to read through the questions that you've posed and consider whether they have anything to add.
Okay, good. Yes. Their members of the group are actually very active right now, giving suggestions for how South Bend can spend its budget. And as I pointed out, a budget reflects our values, and the West Side has often been neglected and needs to have attention. So we're supporting, some of us were supporting more economic development on the West Side. And then also we have a great concern for those who are renters right now who are subject to eviction. Our eviction rates are way too high. So we've gotten involved with some of those things, and I would encourage anyone to think about, even if we don't have anything called reparations going on, how can we be more equitable with our budget now? I would also add that there are educational programs that we're putting on, like we had one on health disparities with Dr. Eintertz, the Director of Public Health, and encouraging the Department of Health to continue to address those disparities, to try to eliminate some of them. Those are areas where, those in the area of healthcare can get involved. The Civil Rights Heritage Center is a great clearinghouse for a lot of this.
Great, thank you. One of the questions that's come through is whether or not there's a fund or a place where if those who want to willingly or voluntarily donate funds in support of reparations, either direct reparations or support for the working group talking about reparations, is there a place where they might be able to do that?
We don't have anything set up, but that's a great idea. Do contact me or other members of the working group that you know of. And yeah, we probably should say, how do you get involved with the working group? Again, I guess the easiest right now is email me and I'll refer you to Nimbalasha Cushing, who manages the list. I do personally donate to something called Stolen Wealth Returns, which supports some young people who are African-American who have huge student loan debts and are working on social justice, social change work that doesn't pay very well, and helping them to pay their loans back. There are numerous things, but the reparations group doesn't have anything specific set up. Thank you for the encouragement to do that.
Would you be able to type the name of that group that you just mentioned into the chat really quickly?
Okay, yeah, I think I might have to stop sharing to do that.
Okay. And then there was a question about the PowerPoint. I think we can post that along with the recording. So we'll definitely put that up as well, along with the list of references. Another question, does anyone know how much rental assistance from the federal government COVID relief program has been allocated and spent in this area? A idea about reparations would be to allow families to purchase homes in the area from absentee landlords if the city could assist with repairs.
Well, I do know that I sit on the Portage Township trustee board, and I know that so far in rental assistance, we processed about $900,000. And there's still money left. But I know that that's what we processed through the Portage Township trustee's office.
Great. Those are the questions that we have so far. Obviously, one more call for those who have any other comments that they'd like to add in terms of Dr. Tetzlaff's questions. There's a number of a number of comments coming through here, inspired by the conversation, waiting for the government to take action to get us off the hook, so to speak. I think in the way you are going to engage IUSB teacher candidates in a conversation about how they can provide professional reparations in their future classrooms, anyone can explore what they can do on their own. Individuals taking personal and professional actions that might in some way meet both approaches. Deb Stanley addressed the two forks, if you will, of reparations. And Dr. McGuire notes, if you'd like to continue the conversation about racial social justice, there's a Food for Thought community breakfast coming up September 24th from 9 to 10 at the Civil Rights Heritage Center. And there's a link for RSVPing to that. A lot of great links coming through. So maybe in addition to posting the PowerPoint and the recording and the references, we should also post the chat for all these different links. So some ideas about the Freedom Summer and places maybe to stay in Nashville. So yeah, I think this is great. I think we would just continue to encourage people to stay involved. I'm sure you're very easy to get in touch with, Dr. Tetzlaff, and the folks over at the Civil Rights Heritage Center as well. So I know that I'll be sending a recording to this to some of the people in my life so that they can watch it, and I'm sure that they'll be interested in getting involved as well. So.
Yeah, I noticed that Brenda Phillips just posted that we are going to have a Freedom Summer Tour this year. So if you're an IUSB student or you know an IUSB student, please let them know.
All right, I will turn it back over to you to close us out, Josh.
Thank you so much, Monica, Mohammed, Derek. It's been wonderful having you here tonight. I think it's been a real evening of learning, and thank you for all of us. I guess before we go, I would like to remind everybody. Let's see if I can do the share screen one more time. There we go. Next month, October 21st, that's not just 2021, it's also October 21, so 10/21/21. Professor Tarek Zidane will be talking about mental health and disability issues among Arab and Muslim Americans, pressing and current issues. Hope to see you here. It'll be all online again, just like this, so watch your inboxes and wherever you get your pop-up notifications. So we'll be glad to see you in October. Please feel free to visit the link you see on your screen, or, just Google IUSB pop-up, and it's the first thing that shows up. You can find our YouTube videos, plus all of the other things we've been promising you the last few minutes, as well as watch for upcoming live streams and donate for support if you're interested. And thank you again. Thank you, Professor Tetzlaff. Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Derek. Thank you, Stephanie. And thank you, everybody. We'll see you next month. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Josh. Bye.